The Navy has always been an interesting part of Foxhole, and with the recent introduction of aircraft to the game, had their world turned upside down. Foxhole is a game where two teams of thousands of players each participate in a persistent online war that can last for more than a month, with logistics chains and large-scale battles being the core elements of it. So there were bound to be some issues with planes. But first, a quick disclaimer. I don't think introducing aircraft in the Airborne update was a mistake. In a game where thousands of players have to interact to find out optimal strategies and pipelines, there were bound to be butterfly effects that would have been difficult to predict. It's impossible to get it right the first time, so hopefully there are some changes coming as soon as the first Airborne war ends. Navies in Foxhole are comprised of two sizes for ships, simply called large ships and small ships. In Foxhole, as a war progresses, the game's tech tree develops. The first few days would see small ships being used, and by the end, battleships and submarines will have made their debut. In the Airborne update, plenty of new small ships were added to the game, as the devs wanted to discourage us from using what we called battle barges for early war naval battles. The larger ships, of course, required far more resources than small ships, and can do things small ships just simply can't, like massive shore bombardments, full-scale naval invasions, and in the case of submarines, launching hugely destructive torpedoes at unsuspecting naval vessels. Aircraft somewhat changed and, in many cases, replaced these roles entirely. That being said, planes being overpowered in their first outing isn't too surprising for me. They are, after all, the center of the update, and if they were underpowered, they wouldn't be used very much. A slight disaster. Maybe the developers didn't want to take that kind of risk. Before the introduction of aircraft, how naval engagements between large ships were conducted was fairly well understood. In ideal circumstances, none of the combatants would be in visual range of each other at all, depending on their spotters or sonar operators to work well with their gunners in firing shells, correcting for wind, direction of their opponent, and targeting specific compartments of ships to hit with naval artillery, torpedoes, or depth charges. Coordination with land-based artillery, small ships, baiting tactics, using islands for cover, and the occasional tactical ram were also part of the wider strategy. Although occasionally, broadsiding opposing ships did happen, with some boarding action occurring when the opportunity presented itself.
Get on the sub, get on the sub, everyone on the sub, everyone on the sub, get on.
While not ideal, it did lead to much easier hits for the gunnery crew, and does look infinitely cooler. However, submarines became the ideal ship to use for large naval battles, with their use increasing as crews became more familiar with the platform. This would lead to them being pushed further back in the tech tree, to allow surface engagements between large ships to become more common before every ship needed to be on their toes and staring at their sonars when submarines came into play with their deadly torpedoes. With the introduction of the Airborne update, these engagement ranges changed. Aircraft could strike at large ships before they could even get in indirect range of each other, with the exception of submarines, as no plane is currently intended to have any anti-submarine warfare capabilities. But early in the first Airborne War, before the tech tree developed much, both sides only had one plane that could engage ships: scout planes. The Warden scout plane launched pairs of mini torpedoes from a distance, and the Colonial scout plane dropped explosive mines from above. I joined many naval operations involving fleets of small ships, which were oftentimes engaged by Warden scout planes. The scout planes would frequently fire their mini torpedoes within visual range. However, the more skilled pilots and bombardiers would fully maximize the range of their torpedoes, oftentimes striking from off-screen. These mini torpedoes also dealt just enough damage to disable anti-air boats with a single salvo, forcing them to either be left behind by the rest of the fleet or be sitting ducks to be sunk by one more salvo, rather than using other ships as meat shields for more torpedoes while stricken anti-air boats were repaired. While the Warden scout plane attacked naval targets on the horizontal plane, the Colonial scout plane struck from the vertical plane, dropping hull-breaker mines from above. Oftentimes, diving down to the target was the only way to guarantee a hit. A very risky maneuver, especially when under fire.
That's a boat. We don't want to fight that.
Yeah, sure. Oh, we're back.
Oh, hit a mine! No!
High altitude drops to stay out of machine gun range were still possible, at least with enough practice and a large enough target. I've heard rumors that the sea mine has a small chance of disabling turrets on large ships, though I have yet to confirm this myself. This asymmetry was intended by the devs, as stated in the Art of Foxhole art book, to train pilots for their faction's specialized aircraft. The torpedo bomber for the Wardens, and the dive bomber for the Colonials. Both scout planes could shut down exposed crews, and any naval invasion utilizing the rarely used landing boats could be easily stopped by a single scout plane strafe from behind. As can be seen in this case, when the Wardens deployed a long-hook landing ship in an adjacent region to launch swarms of landing craft from, all with a single occupant, the driver. With minimal air cover, they were seen driving straight into Spearhead Island's naval minefields to clear them. This, however, gave Colonial pilots the opportunity to test themselves against a simulated naval invasion. The results speak for themselves. Although this method for naval invasions, while intended by the devs, was no longer the meta by the time the Airborne update rolled around. Nowadays, we just slam the main landing craft into the beach and unload troops from there, as it was far more efficient. So, scout planes showed their worth against small ships. But there was a moment in time when large ships such as destroyers and frigates were in play at the same time as scout planes. And crucially, before more advanced aircraft such as the dedicated torpedo bomber, dive bomber, and heavy bombers were researched on the tech tree. There were a couple of incidents where relatively dirt-cheap scout planes directly engaged large ships. The first incident I managed to witness was when World Chat informed me of a Colonial destroyer being chased into our own territory by multiple Warden scout planes. So I spawned on board to witness it. There were so many scout planes in the air that the lag was very, very noticeable. The destroyer would manage to escape.
-1.
On one of the destroyer's succeeding outings, however, those scout planes were joined by a single Warden frigate, which after a broadside engagement, sank the destroyer.
Yeah, that's a good game.
Clearly, a rethink was in order. That's just how things are with new mechanics in this game. We have to experiment to figure out what works and what doesn't. Clearly, large ships couldn't carry on with mostly solo expeditions anymore. I would join the Cabal/CMRC Colonial Destroyer in the Orebreaker Isles. Initially, they went into the combat zone armed to the teeth. Almost a dozen anti-air boats surrounded the ship, and a squadron of fighter aircraft covered them from the air. They would expend their full load of ammunition without taking too much damage, showing the strategy to be working. However, after rearming at a nearby seaport, most of their air cover would be stripped away, destroyed by an incoming invasion force that was redirected to attack the destroyer. It was a collective effort from the Western Wardens. Without aircraft, the destroyer's anti-air machine guns and the guns of the anti-air boat escort were often outranged by these scout planes, and a lack of flak batteries in the ocean could not make up for this deficit. After a few swarms of scout planes attack, the destroyer, with most of its hit points still intact, decided to retreat. New ships would rotate in, with aircraft being pulled in when possible to combat swarms of scout planes that chased the destroyer, all the way to 4 regions deep into friendly colonial territory, where it was finally sunk by scout planes on one-way trips, as their fuel tanks would prove insufficient for a return flight. While this did display the resolve of Warden scout plane pilots, those mini torpedoes would need a whopping 193 hits to sink a destroyer on hit points alone. Although, it should be noted that they were fired in salvos of 2. By comparison, it would take around 129 shells from naval artillery to do the same. Note that the mini torpedoes did not punch any small holes into the destroyers, and it's unknown if this was an intended change differing from the testing server. After this incident, the Western Colonial Navy rarely sent any large ships out to sea. I based myself in the West for most of this part of the war, and it took almost 2 weeks for me to hear about another friendly destroyer sailing out in the West. The joke was that the Colonial Navy was underwater, both in the form of a reef and because a lot of them would start using submarines, which could hide from all these newfangled aircraft. The threat was so great that a normally trivial task of deleting a small island with a destroyer's shore bombardment could not be undertaken, as was seen when the Wardens took the flare after an incident known as the Rapture occurred. After many failed attempts, it took a bombing run to finally destroy any Warden resistance on the island. Regardless of how the Western Colonial Navy played out, plenty of excursions with fleets of small ships would still occur, and later on, the very rare occurrence of a destroyer sailing out to dehusk a storm cannon or engage a frigate. However, whether you're a Colonial or a Warden, needing to assemble at least 60 players to protect a single large ship is not ideal. 20 to 30 players to crew a destroyer or frigate, 20 more to man anti-air boats and meat shields to block quillback torpedoes, and finally another 10 or more for players flying fighters to engage enemy aircraft. 60 players is half the population of a team in a single region. Requirements like this would force fleets to stay together to be protected by this defensive bubble, reducing the chance of any strategic maneuvers being done with the exception of submarines. Battles such as the Battle of the Fingers in War 122 and the Battle of the Godcrofts in War 125 simply wouldn't be possible. A quick disclaimer though, I'm a Colonial for War 132. But historically, I switch sides often and typically enjoy naval gameplay no matter which faction I'm on. I have every interest in seeing large-scale naval battles in this game again. And after the Airborne dev stream, I'm sure that the devs do too.
We had to add some more maps because something we were feeling was that the naval gameplay was getting somewhat suffocated. We needed more space if we're going to add aircraft to it.
Good intentions, but players are gonna optimize. While that was the situation for the Western Colonial Navy, the East had a stronger push for a colonial naval presence. I would join the Trident VF Regiment for a few naval operations. And while the first large operation ended with a staring contest and the landing ship being spotted by Warden scout planes, I would see some action with them when the Warden torpedo bomber and the Colonial dive bombers were unlocked. The much anticipated aircraft carrier would also be researched in this time frame. During these operations, the carrier was typically stationed in an adjacent region without an airfield, away from the action, to save from any operation's population budget and to keep it safe. Nowadays, carriers tend to be stationed in regions without airfields, so that dive bombers can rearm more quickly. Now, back to the airplane that a lot of people have opinions about. The Warden torpedo bomber. During an operation where a massive fleet of small boats drove into the waters of the Warden-controlled island of Satyr Stone, I would first encounter the newly researched torpedo bomber in a live Foxhole war. It turned out that the airfield was rather busy when we showed up, and the Wardens were interested in some live fire exercises.
North side, north side. Maneuver kill. It counts, it counts. Torp! Actual torp in front of us. It went under us. Oh my god. Oh god.
It's a good thing that I had a very good driver in my anti-air boat.
Freaking told you guys we need more A-boats.
Yeah, we need way more A-boats. Come on, this one has to die. There's so many of us on it.
We're chasing. Get it.
I am dead. Nice. Stop.
Oh, they found another one. Why is it everywhere?
After all that fancy driving. Oh shit.
That was straightforward. Forward, man.
The fleet unfortunately had to leave our disabled anti-air boats behind.
Alright, that's the last of them.
Light him up. No!
Oh man.
Well,
So, how's everyone's day? Yo ho.
honestly, it's awesome.
Really?
I love how Colonials just say, they put a map post and say, hey, do Navy right here. And then there's zero, like, oversight. So it's like, hey, just go have fun. I like that.
We definitely survived. The torpedo bomber was feared in colonial circles after the reveal of the Airborne update. In previous iterations of the game, submarine-launched torpedoes were the bane of colonial naval operations, as the general perception was that the much smaller and nimbler Warden submarine was better than the gigantic colonial submarine that was armed with an artillery gun and the ability to reload torpedoes almost anywhere. The winding rivers in colonial territory would not help this sentiment. While a few buffs were given to its turn rate, the perception would remain. However, while the colonial submarine was undoubtedly more cumbersome to operate due to its size, the platform would manage to use its ability to reload 8 torpedoes on any island to great effect in engagements such as the Battle of the Godcrofts, as long as it was able to survive its first fight, that is. Torpedoes were feared because of their ability to create large holes, which would continue to flood a torrent of water into any large ship it struck. Quite different from early repairable small holes created by shells striking a large naval vessel. These large holes would only be able to be repaired until a certain point while at sea, via metal beams being brought to the hole one at a time, usually in very flooded compartments, slowing the crew down. The hole would still leak at a reduced rate, and would disable a ship's ability to anchor for the duration of an operation, cancelling naval landings and leaving ships more open to attacks. Seeing what was essentially a flying submarine being an exclusive plane to the enemy faction would send shivers down the spines of colonial naval officers. However, there was a silver lining. Previously, large holes and disabled turrets were not repairable at sea. Having either of those happen to your ship was a major disappointment, cancelling entire naval operations. With the Airborne update, they would now be repairable at sea. Crews would need to bring 52 metal beams to fully seal a large hole, which could be slightly reopened once struck again, and 250 metal beams would be needed to fully repair a disabled turret. The devs might have some more changes in mind for large ships. We'll just have to wait and see.
We'd love to make more changes to large ships, but these were the ones we needed to make now.
While we did do some tests in the testing server of the game, nothing would prepare us for how reality would hit in a live Foxhole war. I boarded the VF Trident destroyer for a few operations, and when I saw the torpedo bomber in action, I waited to see what new tactics we would employ to counter it. There were Many things we tried. A combination of using small ships as meat shields, hugging cliffs in rivers and avoiding open ocean to limit engagement angles, slews of fighter aircraft to intercept torpedo bombers and their escorts, and even using the destroyer's main gun to strike at a torpedo plane or two that got too close. These were the lengths that they had to go through to survive. And in these kinds of engagements, we would scarcely be able to directly engage the enemy frigate, as we were frequently pushed out of range by incoming air attacks. It should be noted that VF Trident did manage to sink a frigate with a destroyer at least once during the First Airborne War. Only once they didn't have planes. It was done in an ambush during a blizzard, which froze the river. Within minutes, torpedo bombers were scrambled to their position, but were unable to get torpedoes through the unbroken ice. However, while the 2 torpedoes launched by a single torpedo plane were manageable if they hit, 3 torpedo bombers simultaneously attacking a large ship essentially meant that it would soon become a reef. This was difficult to counter, and greatly reduced interest in more naval operations in the East as the war progressed, especially since it was very difficult to even reach open ocean. Not even submarines were safe, as the Warden torpedo bomber, if used correctly, is said to be able to strike submarines that didn't dive deep enough, albeit with coordination with a ship that actually has a sonar. I'd later talk to someone from the submarine here, and they'd tell me that it wasn't a big deal. It was the second time a torpedo bomber torped them, and the colonial submarine's ability to carry metal beams in its racks saved them. They were waist deep in water, but they managed to seal the hole without surfacing. A prominent Warden submarine captain would tell me that the torpedo bomber made the Naki obsolete. Though Nakis are still occasionally spotted stalking colonial large ships in their own rivers. The colonials would also manage to steal a single reservable torpedo bomber that I'm aware of, with the frame caught in transit in an iron ship. The 7 HP regiment would christen it as El Toro. El Toro would go on to claim 2 Warden frigates, doing the principal damage on one and the finishing blow on the other, as it was heavily damaged by the forces of Spearhead Island. However, the Warden faction, of course, had their own problems with colonial aircraft. While the Wardens had the torpedo bomber, the Colonials had the dive bomber, which would prove to be a menace on land and at sea. While it lacked the same ship-killing power as the Warden torpedo bomber, the bombs it dropped were incredibly effective at disabling a ship's turrets. Essentially, once dive bombers could swarm a Warden frigate or battleship, they could disable their main form of attack against other vessels, or stop a shore bombardment mission entirely. I've heard of Warden crews having to bring a full load of metal beams on board and using all of them before retreating, just because of dive bombers disabling their turrets. I couldn't enter the region in this case, but here's a screenshot of the map when colonial dive bombers swarmed 3 frigates and stopped them in their tracks in the region of Endless Shore. At Spearhead Island, we've relied on dive bombers to deny these types of attacks from the frequent naval shore bombardment operations that occurred in the region. They're very effective, though we usually have to rely on other platforms to finally sink any large ships in the region, such as gunboats that can strike them once they're disarmed, if they aren't taken out by airplanes first. The dive bombers were good at scaring ships away, but not as effective at sinking them. Dive bombers continued to be a problem on land for the Wardens, striking tank lines until there are no more visible targets or sufficient fighter cover is brought in to ward them away. Though I've seen the Wardens use their faction-exclusive Sea Fighters' superior firepower to discourage dive bombers. They may be slower than regular fighter planes, but their top speed is still faster than that of the dive bomber. at this stage of the war, the closest thing to anti-armor close air support the Wardens have is the anti-tank rifle strapped to the bottom of their fighter plane, which could only strip off tank armor, not directly damaging tanks. The Wardens need a proper close air support option. Of course, I have left out the last level of escalation that became more prominent as we entered the endgame state of the war's tech tree. Heavy bombers. Normally, these are used to pound airfields and flatten bases, but I've seen the Wardens use them as close air support. Additionally, they've proven to be very effective at taking out large ships. I first witnessed their naval use outside of Dev Branch, when during a massive attack on Spearhead Island, the not a coalition Gambit would launch 2 bombers to engage a battleship and frigate to deal an incredible amount of damage. This would soon be followed up by HVL and Gambit sending 3 bombers to sink the Telephone Regiment's frigate. Trident VF would soon do the same to another frigate. More than once. While the Telephone Regiment's point of view showed very little chance of counterplay, they would get their revenge as the Wardens started doing it too. Bombers seemed to be a very effective tool for attacking large ships, in place of, well, using other large ships. And this is to me one of the more interesting things about Foxhole. Seeing how all these tactics will evolve as these new mechanics are implemented. Will the bomber replace the battleship in its delete everything in that general direction role? It's going to be interesting to observe if Foxhole starts to mirror, well, real-life developments, as players start to understand how the meta works more. Oh, and I have yet to witness a paratrooper plane drop soldiers onto an enemy large ship, though I have heard that the Navy Regiment has done it at least once this war, and really wants to push for the Sky Pirate way of combat. And I would love to see it. We had the Dev Branch testing server before the update to try all of the new tools. A lot of the assumptions that the devs and some of the players had didn't turn out to be the case in a live Foxhole war. I'm not going to get into too many details, this video is too long already. Here are a few, though many are anecdotal as I like to talk to a lot of people. I'm crossing my fingers for some balance changes in the upcoming wars. I understand that balance changes normally don't happen in the middle of a war, because it would be a little bit unfair to those that invested time and resources into making specific assets. Although those bombers are really nasty right now, especially when they can commit to doing a stall bombing run to drop as many bombs in a specific place as possible. Maybe bombers need a nerf mid-war, I don't know. Otherwise this might never end. Especially for the poor facility mains.
Rebuild it all, rebuild it all.
Work.
And the scout plane's gun might need some bloom for the sake of the infantry. I have a feeling that the comment section of this video is going to be slightly terrifying. Okay, I'm done talking about balance. I hope I didn't ruffle too many feathers there. I love aircraft, I love flying in the game, but I miss naval engagements. The conclusion still stands though. Naval combat became about who has the bigger air force. And I agree. Oh, and if all goes to plan, the next video is a pretty high effort one about a specific operation.